Welcome to Legal Video Resource. I'm Jason Wheatholter. In this video, we're talking about things to look for in a deposition video camera. Let's discuss some of the key features to look for in a deposition video camera. The first thing to look at are the capture formats, or the capture media, and the runtime that you get with those formats in that media. So what do I mean by formats? Well, more particularly, I mean codecs. Codecs like MPEG-4 versus lossless versus ProRes. Those are the capture formats or codecs specifically that I'm talking about. And the reason that those are important is that no matter how pristine the image is that you're capturing, no matter how good it looks to your naked eye, no matter how impressive the lens is that you're capturing it through, no matter how great the sensor is, if you're using a really high compression format or a format that's not designed for what it is that you're shooting, then your video is going to look awful. That source video that you capture is really going to be useless for pretty much anything else, or it's going to really impair the quality of every other version of that video that you make down the road when you convert it to one format or another. So the capture format is, next to the camera sensor and lens, it's the one aspect of your camera that really determines the image quality. So when you're looking at different capture formats, consider that. The second thing is the media that the camera captures to. So it used to be that cameras were all tape-based, and we're all used to high-8 tapes, or maybe you worked in mini DV, maybe you worked when there were old broadcast tapes, or maybe there were even film reels that you've worked on before. That's media. That's what cameras, film cameras, video cameras all capture to, different types of media. Nowadays, most everything is tapeless, or it captures to a hard drive or an SD card, some digital piece of media like that. So consider what type of media it captures to, because some media is way more expensive than others. SD cards, relatively inexpensive, relatively easy to find. So kind of availability and also cost of media is a really big concern, because you can get media that maybe costs 10 times as much for the same storage space as what you get on an SD card. Now, those two things, formats or codecs and media, determine the runtime, because the higher compression the format, so the smaller the file size based on the codec, and the larger the storage space on the media, the more runtime you can capture per card or per piece of media, whatever it is. So again, going back to tapes typically 60 minutes, maybe 80 minutes, but you knew that's what the tape was going to capture, because mini DV, that codec or that format, it was always going to be 60 minutes per tape. Or if you bought 80-minute long-run tapes, you could do that. You could buy the bigger cassettes that would do 120 minutes. I think some even did 240 minutes at certain quality settings. But those are all kinds of combinations of the format, mini DV, the media, the type of tape, and the runtime on the tape that ultimately ended up with that runtime. SD cards, hard drives, it all works the same way. It's just all files. It's all digital now. And really, mini DV was kind of that way. It was just the kind of crossover between tape-based or film-based capture and now tapeless capture on SD cards. It was really kind of a crossover. So think about the format that you're going to capture to, the media that you're going to capture onto, and the runtime you're going to get from that media. Because as you shoot deposition video, you're going to want something that works really well for a talking head style video. Something that looks, again, not unlike what you're seeing right now. Somebody on camera speaking basically to a camera, but not a lot of complexity to the scene. I don't have a lot of different colors or a lot of changes of scenes from dark to bright. It's a relatively straightforward kind of image for a camera to capture, so the codec doesn't need to be particularly high quality, of technical high quality. It needs to be visually high quality, but it doesn't necessarily need to be technically high quality. The media, you want something that's going to be reliable, that's going to be, flexible for your needs. So you want something that's going to work in your camera And you also want something that's going to record plenty of record time. And so in the deposition video realm, that's at least an hour per piece of media. And nowadays with tapeless cameras and MPEG-4 and MPEG-5 capture formats coming around, you can really get a lot onto an SD card. You can get 12 hours of video onto a lot of easily accessible SD cards nowadays, depending on the camera, the format or codec setting, and the size of the media. But you want to have a piece of media that can run for at least an hour, preferably 2. The second thing you're going to look for in deposition video cameras are manual controls. And what I mean by manual controls are manual controls for gain, for iris or aperture, for focus, manual controls over pretty much everything that goes into creating that image on the file that you're capturing to. That can also include shutter speed, white balance, manual controls over all of that. You want to have as much manual control because in a deposition video, again, most everything is going to be relatively similar. There's not a lot of quick changes. You're not shooting run and gun style like you do evidentiary video or maybe on a short film or advertising, something like that, or a documentary even. So you want to have manual controls, but you want to make sure they're easily accessible because things do change in the room as the day progresses in a deposition. You know, if you start in the morning, it might not be really bright on that side of the office building that you're in. But as you get into the afternoon, sun might start to creep into the windows, and now that room is getting brighter and brighter and brighter. So you want to be able to adjust those manual controls as necessary. So as the light comes in, you might want to turn down that aperture, close down that aperture just a little bit. And so you want to make sure these manual controls are easily accessible because while things don't change real frequently, they do change throughout the course of a deposition. And since you're recording for, an hour or more, maybe even 2 hours at a time, you don't have a lot of time to say, oh, let's stop here and let me make some adjustments before we go back on the record. You don't really have that ability unless something is going really, really wrong and you have to make a change. Most of the time, you kind of want to, as a deposition videographer, kind of shrink into the background and make as little impact on the deposition as possible in terms of its procedure and just kind of allow the deposition to progress without you interfering in any way. And so one of the ways to do that is to be able to make little adjustments like aperture, closing down the aperture smoothly, closing it down easily while you're recording. And that's the reason for manual controls, is to be able to make these adjustments while you're recording and not have to go into the menus. Because, if you've ever taken or done still photography, there are shutter release cables that let you kind of take your hand away from the camera. And so you can click a shutter, especially on, really dark scenes where you have really long periods of time where the shutter is open. Because you don't want to have this handling noise of you touching the camera to hit the shutter button and bumping and moving the camera. Same thing goes for deposition video. You don't want to be messing around in the menus, like tapping on a touch screen. If anything, you want to just gently rest your hand on the iris ring or the focus ring or whatever it is, or the zoom ring, and just gently make that change and then take your hand off, and you have minimal kind of interaction with the camera and minimal impact on the image quality. The next thing you want to look for in a deposition video camera is the lens itself. And when I'm talking about the lens, you obviously want a quality lens, but pretty much any professional or prosumer video camera or ENG style camera is going to have a really, really good lens, especially for deposition video. Again, we're not talking about, a multi-million-dollar movie. We're talking about capturing, in a way, news footage, essentially news footage. You're capturing video, and pretty much any lens that you can get on a camera is going to be really high quality. So quality isn't so much a concern in these professional ENG style cameras. It's more about the reach, the focal length of that lens, the flexibility of that lens. Now, there's something to be aware of when choosing deposition cameras, or really cameras in general. A lot of times you will see, in sales and advertising, this is a 22x lens, or this is a 24x lens, or this is a 100x lens. that's fantastic. But that X means that number, whatever it is, 22, 24, 100, whatever, that means that number is relative. Relative to what? That's the problem. You don't know what it's relative to until you dive deeper in. So, for example, a 100x lens that starts at, let's say, 3.8 millimeters, which is really wide, but 3.8 millimeters, well, that means you can go 3.8 to 380. But if you have, let's say, trying to think of a number that makes sense. Let's say you have a lens that's 22x, but starts at 30 millimeters. I hope I have this math right. Then 30 times 22 gets you 660. So even though 22x is much smaller than 100x, because where you start is much different, 3.8 versus 30, where you end is much, much different. And that x, I mean, it's good, it's interesting information to have, it's good marketing material, but it doesn't really answer the question, does it work for what you need? So you need to move to talking about lenses or looking at and researching lenses for deposition video in absolute terms. And the easiest way to do that, to kind of talk in terms that are kind of universal and also absolute, are to talk about them in 35 millimeter equivalent. So 35 millimeter is kind of the film standard that's been around forever for shooting film, both stills and movies. And so everybody built lenses and focal lengths traditionally based on this 35 millimeter lens or 35 millimeter frame size. And so lenses, the amount of focal length or the amount they can zoom in changes from camera to camera based on that sensor size. There's a whole lot of math that goes on in here, but the important thing is to look at, pretty much every camera is going to give you the 22x or it's going to give you the 35 millimeter equivalent of what that 22x range is. There are a lot of cameras out there that you can find that do 24, 28 millimeters on the wide setting, that zoom all the way into 600 millimeters plus on the zoomed in side of things. And that millimeter range is really just about, how wide or how zoomed in, how tight that focal length on that lens is. So the smaller the number, like 38, 24, 30 millimeters, 50 millimeters, the smaller that number, so if you get into like 16 millimeters, the wider the angle is. The higher the number, the smaller the angle is, meaning the more zoomed in the lens is. So, for example, the lens you're looking at currently is zoomed into 35 millimeters on a micro four thirds sensor. And so what that means is that 35 millimeter equivalent on this lens is actually, because it's a micro four thirds, to make that 35 millimeter equivalent, you have to multiply that times 2. So really, you're kind of looking at me on a lens that's zoomed into a 70 millimeter equivalent in 35 millimeter terms. Really confusing, I know, but look at the information that's available for each lens and see what the absolute zoom range is of that lens. Again, you're looking for something that on the wide end is around the 24, 30 millimeter mark. And on the close end, on the zoomed in on end, it's at least 300 millimeters, and you can probably get a lot further in. The fourth thing to look for are the audio inputs and outputs on the camera. Now, these are really important because they kind of, in a way, are an indicator of whether or not the camera is professional. So if the camera has XLR inputs, it's typically a professional camera. If it doesn't have XLR inputs, beware, because that might mean it's not really a professional camera. It's not a camera that's designed to be used by professionals. So you kind of need to check and see, does it have professional style inputs? Or at least, does it have inputs that are going to interface with my equipment? XLR isn't necessarily the be-all, end-all for deciding whether or not a camera is professional. It's just a really quick indicator. If you're searching for a camera on a website or you're doing some research and you see XLR inputs, that's probably a good indicator that this is a professional camera. If you don't see them, there might be a reason for that. Maybe it's not professional, or you have to buy the adapter that's built for that camera specifically to add XLR inputs. When you're talking about really, really high-end film and media cameras, a lot of them don't have XLR inputs because they assume that everybody's going to record what's called separate system audio. So the audio is going to be recorded separate from the video. But a lot of these really high-end cameras still have maybe an adapter or something that's built specifically for that camera that allows XLR inputs into that camera. Again, XLR isn't the only thing. It's not the be-all end-all. It's just a really good indicator. But if you're looking for a camera, make sure that the audio inputs match what it is that you're going to be using in terms of your mixer in your deposition kit. Most mixers are going to have XLR outputs, so on your camera, you want XLR inputs. You want to make sure on your camera that you have a separate headphone output. Maybe it's really important that your camera also has a line output or some other audio output. Maybe they're RCA jacks, old analog style RCA jacks. It just kind of depends on your needs, but look at the audio inputs and make sure that they are professional and that they interface with your other equipment. The last thing to really look for as kind of a requirement for deposition video cameras is the time and date stamp. That time and date serves as a marker of when that video was actually recorded. And when that marker matches up with what it is you say as a videographer on the record, or the discussions that everybody has in the room as the deposition is going on, or when you compare that marker on your video record, on the deposition video, to the court reporter's record, or as attorneys in the room, here you read the time and date and you're reading that time and date off of your camera, and they hear you read that time and date and nobody objects or nobody has a problem with that time and date, then chances are that that's a true and correct video. Some jurisdictions don't require it, others do. Some clients don't want it, others require it. So it's a feature that you're probably going to need. You don't necessarily need in every single deposition video or every single legal video, but it's a feature that you probably want to have available for the purpose of having it available to meet the requirements of the people that you're subcontracting with or the clients that you're working for. So those are some of the key things to look for when choosing or selecting a deposition video camera. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, I encourage you, click subscribe down below, because as we post new videos to this channel, you'll be the first to get notified about them. Also, if you have a question or a comment, maybe something you want more details about, or something that you just want to discuss with us, leave us a comment down below. Let us know, because we can answer those there or maybe in a video further on down the road. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next time on Legal Video Resource.